Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Old Testament manuscripts in our continuing study of how we got our Bible. You remember the issue for textual criticism is that we don't have the original manuscripts. We don't even have copies of them. We have copies of copies of copies, multi-generational copies of these manuscripts. And the question comes up, did errors creep into the text? Most of the manuscripts that we have of the Old Testament come to us via the Masoretes. Now, the name Masoretes, their name Masorah, is the Hebrew word tradition. And so these were keepers of the Hebrew traditions. They had their base at a Jewish community in Tiberias, located on the southwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. The Masoretes gave us the vowel points, and that's quite helpful. Notice the Hebrew, and even if you can't read it, you can see there are letters on both sides, but the side on the right, and it just says Adonai Elohim. On the right, there's no dots or dashes underneath the letters. On the left, it does have those vowel points, those dots and dashes, and those helped show you how it is to be pronounced. Now, in modern Hebrew, they don't use those. People who read Hebrew fluently don't need those. It's a little bit like those marks that were used when you were first learning to read English. You'd put a little dash or a little curly Q, something or other, over certain English vowels to tell you how they were being pronounced. But once you learn how to read, you don't need those anymore. And Hebrew is much the same way. Now, the Masoretes also had some very careful rules regarding the copying of the scriptures. They were studious, they were careful to a fault. They could tell you how many letters in each book of the Bible and how many words in each book of the Bible. And they put little notations on the side of their manuscripts after they had counted up, after they had written it, and then they would count it, and just to make sure that there had been no mistakes. Our oldest complete copy of the Masoretic text is the Leningrad Codex. It dates to 1010 AD. It's our oldest complete Hebrew Tanakh. By Tanakh, remember, that's the Torah, the Navi'im, and the Ketuvim. That's the entire Hebrew scriptures, or what we Christians call the Old Testament. It was composed in Cairo, but it is now located in the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg. It's currently been published. You can go to a bookstore and purchase the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, and that will be a copy, a printed copy of this codex. Here's a look at the inside of that codex, and notice it was arranged in 3 columns. You have marginal notes, notations, as well as in the upper and lower margin notations, just talking about given to the copyists and about the copyists, and they again help to make sure that it was copied correctly. Notice also, by doing this in 3 columns, it's much easier to read, especially if you're reading it out loud in the synagogue. Now, those were the oldest copies that we had until the mid to late 1940s. And in 1947, by the shores of the Dead Sea, the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, the lowest spot on the face of the earth, a find was made that was going to revolutionize our understanding and especially our copies of the Hebrew text. There by the shores of the Dead Sea, the mountains rise up very quickly. You are 1,400 feet below sea level at the shore of the Dead Sea. If you just head straight west, you'll go up to the Judean highlands, 2,500 feet above sea level. So that's a change of about 4,000 feet. And down by the Dead Sea back then, the only people that you'd find there, generally speaking, were the Bedouin. There were some Bedouin shepherds. Shepherds were typically the young kids in the family, and these 3 were cousins, and they were looking for a lost goat. And there are caves that line the cliffs of the area alongside the Dead Sea. they were looking for a lost goat, and one of them took a rock and threw it into one of these caves, and I'm not sure what happened to the goat. He was expecting and instead there was a crash, and they looked at each other and they said, what could that be? But it was getting late in the day, and so they decided, we'll come back and investigate maybe tomorrow. Well, the next day, the youngest of the cousins, he was up earlier, and so he went by himself and entered the cave in question and found all sorts of things. A broken piece of pottery, a broken pot, and inside were some scrolls. His cousins got upset with him, the fact that he had gone without them, and they all eventually went back to the caves. And when all was said and done, they had found 7 scrolls, which they brought back to the camp, and they kept on in a goatskin for a number of days, maybe weeks or even months. I'm not sure how long was taken. But eventually they took these scrolls, or maybe the adults in the family took the scrolls. Here's a picture of 2 of those cousins. Now, this is quite a bit later. They were just teenagers at the time, and so this picture was taken maybe 10 years later or so. But they took them to Bethlehem, where there was a shoe salesman, a shoemaker, but he was also an antiquities dealer by the name of Kando. And he sought to find a purchaser. He probably gave them a few dollars for their efforts, which they appreciated, not realizing how much more these scrolls were worth. Kando eventually got 3 of the scrolls to Eliezer Sukenik. He was a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, while another 4 scrolls went to Marv Samuel, the metropolitan bishop. When Sukenik was actually looking at the scroll, he remarked that the day he opened up the first scroll and was reading it, it was the same day that over the radio he was listening to how the United Nations had just recognized the state of Israel. So this was 1948 by the time he got a chance to look at it and read it, and he recalls thinking that the last time this scroll had been read, Israel had been a nation, and now here it was a nation again. Now, Marv Samuel, he was a representative of ASOR, the American Schools of Oriental Research. Sukenik, as I said, from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the 3 scrolls that he had, one was an incomplete manuscript of Isaiah. There would ultimately be 2 Isaiah manuscripts. The other 2 were not biblical texts. One was what we call the Thanksgiving hymn, and also the War Scroll. These were other sectarian writings. We'll talk briefly about them in another place. Meanwhile, Marv Samuel, the metropolitan of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, had a larger Isaiah scroll, and larger because it was complete, but it was a bit different from the other Isaiah scroll in that it had some editorial changes. Now, the book hadn't notably been changed, but every once in a while there'd be a word maybe that had been updated, a word that might have gone out of use in the years just before the coming of Christ, as opposed to the Hebrew of Isaiah's day. And so it had some small editorial changes like that. He also had a book known as the Community Rule, a scroll known as the Pesher Habakkuk, that is a commentary on the Old Testament book of Habakkuk, and one called the Genesis Apocryphon. Now, when you hear that, you think, well, that's part of the book of Genesis. Actually, it's a book that takes some of the characters of the book of Genesis and writes some rather fanciful stories and prophecies and things about them. Now, Marv Samuel eventually moved to the United States, and when he did so, he took his 4 scrolls with him, and he put the scrolls up for sale in a newspaper advertisement. Here in the Wall Street Journal, we have the little advertisement that he took out, the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC. He was really pretty much on target with that. They were for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution, or by an individual or group. Now, the scrolls were eventually purchased by Yigal Yadin. He is the son of Eliezer Sukenik, who had found out about the other 4 scrolls. Yadin was a general in the Israeli army, and he purchased the scrolls through a series of intermediaries. He didn't want to just go himself because he felt the price might go substantially up. And so someone from a local university in New York was contacted to make the purchase, and the scrolls eventually made their way back to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In the years that followed, both the Bedouin, who realized, gee, there's something valuable here, as well as archaeologists, began combing the caves in the Dead Sea region, looking for other scrolls. What we're seeing here is a picture of Cave 4. It's a artificially man-made cave. You can sort of see the flat entrance there on the side, and then there's another entrance from up top. Cave 4, of all the caves, and there were 11 caves in which scrolls were found, most of them came from Cave 4. And other scrolls were found in these other caves. There was also an archaeological dig that was made of the area of Qumran. That Qumran wasn't the ancient name. That's what the Arabs called it. And this area dated back to the time before Jesus and up to about 70 AD, was ultimately abandoned with the fall of Jerusalem and the coming of the Romans. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls have scrolls in languages. Most of them are in Hebrew. There are a few Aramaic, and there are even fewer in Greek. The writing materials are mostly parchment. Remember, that's animal skin, although there are a few papyri, and there is 1 copper scroll. The subject matter. Quite a number of the scrolls are biblical texts, and of course, when I say biblical texts, I'm talking about from what we call the Old Testament, no New Testament, because that had not been written yet when these scrolls were being written. There are other Jewish writings, other Jewish books, extra biblical books, and there are also writings or books of a unique Jewish sect, which we refer to today as the Essenes, and Josephus even back then referred to them by that name as well, although they do not refer to themselves in such a way. The total number of documents have been about 930. Now I say about because sometimes there's only pieces, and we have a hard time determining, do some of those pieces go with other pieces, but it's estimated to be right about 930 separate documents. The dates on these go from 250 BC at the earliest to 50 AD at the latest, with most being between 150 and 50 BC, a period of about 100 years. Here's a makeup of the scrolls that have been found. Notice 25% are biblical texts. We said sectarian from that particular sect. That's 37%. Common Jewish writings, other post-biblical or extra-biblical writings, 27%. And there's about 11% that we just don't know. We're not sure where they came from because the pieces, the fragments are so small, they are difficult to identify. Now let's talk about some of the textual issues that we find as a result of the Dead Sea Scrolls. First of all, we have in 4Q Exodus A, and I need to explain that. The 4 in front of the designation means that this came from Cave 4. Q is Qumran, so Cave 4 of the Qumran caves. This is from Exodus, and then there's a designation A. This is the first scroll of Exodus. There may have been others, and we're going to see that letter change from depending on what scroll we're looking at. Well, in this case, in 4Q Exodus A, the text of the Dead Sea Scroll reads that there were 75 people who came. This is Exodus 1:5. The 75 people came out of Canaan and into Egypt along with Jacob when the Israelites moved into Egypt. Now, that's in contrast to the Masoretic text, which reads there were 70 souls. So did the Masoretic text inadvertently add a 5, or was the 5 dropped? I'm sorry, was it dropped from the Masoretic text, or was it added? The answer is we don't know, but the Dead Sea Scroll is 1,000 years earlier than the Masoretic text. So if you're going by the earlier reading, you would say that 75 is the correct reading. A second example is 4Q Deuteronomy J. Again, that's Cave 4 of Qumran, Deuteronomy, but there's quite a few copies of Deuteronomy found in Cave 4, so it has the designation J. And in Deuteronomy chapter 32:8, it makes reference to the Bene El, that is the sons of God, in contrast to the Masoretic text, which reads children or sons of Israel. And so Bene El versus Bene Israel. Somebody dropped the Israel, or they added that. Which was it? Again, we don't know, but the older reading reads sons of God in that passage. It doesn't change the overall meaning, but it does change that designation. A third example is 4Q Samuel A, that is, again from Cave 4, the book of Samuel, and it adds several verses before it reaches, just before 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. Remember, 1 Samuel 11:1, that's the story of how Nahash the Ammonite goes up against Jabesh Gilead, and they say, well, we're going to surrender, and he says, fine, I'm going to gouge out your right eye. And in these added verses, it actually begins the story by saying that Nahash the Ammonite captured a number of cities and gouged out the right eye of all the people he captured. And now the story picks up. And so that's a little bit of background information that's added in the Dead Sea Scroll. Was that part of the original text? Was that just a commentator telling us a bit? Again, we don't know for sure. Here's another issue between Psalm 145 verses 13 and 14, and I need to explain about that psalm. That psalm is an acrostic psalm where each verse begins, for example, verse 1 begins with an aleph, and then verse 2 begins with the letter Beit, and then Gimel and Daleth, so that you have each letter of each verse begins with the appropriate letter of that Hebrew alphabet, and it walks you through the Hebrew alphabet until you get to verse 13, which that verse starts with the letter Nun, and then you go to the with the letter Mem, I'm sorry, and then you go to the next verse expecting to see the letter Nun, what we call the N, and instead it skips a letter. There's only 21 verses instead of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, but in the Dead Sea Scroll, it inserts that. I'm going to call it a missing verse. Was it really missing, or did the people who gave us the scroll add the verse just to make it balance? And actually, when they add that verse, here's the added verse: God is faithful in His words and loving kindness in all His deeds. And you can see the Hebrew that starts with the Naaman, the Nun. It begins with. That same verse is echoed in verse 17, interestingly enough, which says the Lord is righteous in His words and loving kind in all His deeds. Notice it's very close. So was this just added to make it balance out at an earlier date, and then drop from the Masoretic text, or did the Masoretic text somehow lose the verse? And again, I don't know which the answer is, but the older text has that missing verse. Here's another example. First, 1Q Isaiah A. So this is from that very first scroll that was found, the very first cave, the Isaiah scroll. And in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, the Masoretic text there says, therefore the Lord Himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Meanwhile, the Dead Sea Scroll says, therefore, the Lord Himself, wait a second, that's the same word, but notice I've put it in all caps, so it's actually the name of God. We would normally call that, therefore, Yahweh Himself will give you a sign. Hasn't changed the meaning because it's still talking about the Lord. And then the verse goes on, behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and he, notice the Masoretic text says she will call his name Emmanuel. The Dead Sea Scroll says, and he will call his name Emmanuel. His name is still called Emmanuel, But the question is, did she call his name that, or did God call his name that? That would be the reference if we read that he will call his name Emmanuel. Our final example comes from 4Q Samuel, and I forget which scroll it was, so I'm not going to. It might be all the ones that are found, but when we read in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, of the height of Goliath, the Masoretic text says that he is 6 cubits in a span, and that would be around 10 feet tall, which is very, very, very tall. Not saying it can't happen, but the Dead Sea Scroll places the height of Goliath at 4 cubits in a span, which is something like 6'8", very tall, but not necessarily, out of the norm of our historical realm. So it still puts Goliath at a giant of a man, especially in a day and age where people were oftentimes quite a bit shorter, but still not necessarily 10 feet tall.